U.S. President Donald Trump says he will now impose a 50% tariff on copper imports. He made the declaration at a cabinet meeting in Washington, but it's unclear exactly when a new tariff will take effect. Other things, big ones. We did steel, as you know, they're 50%. We did aluminum, 50%. Lumber just came out. Why don't you copper? And we did cars. And now today we're doing copper. In less than 24 hours after Donald Trump signed the order imposing a 50% tariff on imported copper, the United States officially lost a staggering $4. $2 billion. Copper prices on the COMEX exchange surged 13% overnight, hitting a record high of $5.95 per pound. And that was just the beginning. Canada, the supplier of over 40% of refined copper to the U.S., immediately struck back. All export contracts were frozen, and mining giants like Teck Resources and Hudbay Minerals simultaneously halted shipments to the American market. Ottawa made a firm declaration. We can no longer rely on a trade partner that is unstable and unilaterally changes the rules of the game. The market atmosphere flipped instantly. U.S. electronics, construction, and automotive corporations plunged into a supply crisis unseen since wartime. Copper, the silent metal behind every circuit board, every wire, every motor, has now become the center of a new trade war. And this time, Americans are paying the price through every car, every light bulb, and every home they live in. The biggest question now is, what will America do when tariff policies are pushing its entire manufacturing base to the brink? Let's find out in today's Deep State video. And if you want us to keep bringing you the latest updates, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss a thing. Right after Donald Trump activated Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, declaring copper a strategic metal affecting national security, the 50% tariff on all imported copper was officially scheduled to take effect on August 1st, 2025. This wasn't a minor adjustment. It was a heavy blow to one of the most critical links in the U.S. industrial chain. The results were immediate. Copper prices in the U.S. market, specifically CME futures contracts, surged 13% in a single day, hitting record levels of around $5, $64 to $569 per pound. Meanwhile, prices on the London Metal Exchange, LME, not only failed to rise, but actually dipped slightly due to fears of declining U.S. demand, creating a price gap never seen before, with U.S. copper costing up to 25% more than LME. Precisely because of this disparity, a new arbitrage market emerged, exposing what many see as a fundamental failure in the Trump administration's protectionist logic. Just days after the tariff was announced, Canada reacted swiftly and forcefully. Ottawa declared its intent to diversify trade, severing its dependence on the U.S., and actively sought replacement partners in Asia and Europe. Considering that over 52% of Canada's copper exports went to U.S. in 2023, this counterattack wasn't just symbolic. It was a calculated strategy. Mining giants like Glencore in Quebec were now being forced to reconsider and reroute their markets. According to financial experts, if this price gap persists, the U.S. faces a real risk of economic isolation, similar to Hoover era of the 1930s when destructive protectionist policies triggered a global trade freeze. Concrete warnings have surfaced. The surge in domestic copper prices could raise costs across the automotive, energy, and telecommunication sectors, potentially dragging the U.S. into a spiral of inflation and production stagnation, as there simply isn't a fast enough supply alternative. Even more concerning, the U.S. currently produces just over 50% of its refined copper needs and imported about 810,000 tons in 2024, mainly from Canada, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. Meanwhile, domestic refining capacity is extremely limited. Facilities like ASARCO in Arizona have even had to shut down, incapable of replacing import volumes. So the tariff doesn't solve the supply problem. It only creates higher prices, reduced availability, and prolonged supply chain risks. In the end, this 50% copper tariff landed like a stone thrown into the global marketplace. U.S. prices skyrocketed, LME dropped, and an unprecedented price gap opened up. Canada countered decisively, pivoting to new markets. Analysts warn of growing economic isolation and looming supply chain chaos. What started as a story about an industrial metal is now creeping into every car, every power line, every tech product, making it impossible for anyone to ignore the full-scale tension of this tariff policy. The moment Trump's 50% copper tariff was announced, Canada didn't sit still, and they were already holding a powerful weapon. Nearly $3 billion worth of annual copper and refined copper exports, the majority of which had historically gone to the United States. This isn't just a trade figure. It's economic leverage and the foundation Canada used to abruptly rethink its entire strategy. Just days after the tariff declaration, major Canadian mining players like Teck Resources and Hudbay Minerals, Reuters even likened the situation to Glenner, began shifting their approach. Instead of shipping directly to the U.S., they pivoted toward Japan, South Korea, and China. This marked a turning point. Canada began exporting raw copper to be refined in Asia, completely removing the U.S. from the refined supply chain. At the same time, the Canadian government moved quickly. It unveiled a $8 billion Canadian investment plan to expand copper export capacity beyond North America and build new infrastructure to support this strategy. That number is no small matter. It reveals an ambition to transform Canada from a supplier into a strategic rival in the global metals chain. To paint it through storytelling, the first real move in this trade war wasn't made by the U.S., but by Canada. Right after Trump delivered his heavy tariff blow, Ottawa redrew the customer map. Canada's copper exports, once deeply dependent on U.S. customs authorities, now await signals from Asian ports, where the raw metal will be refined and sold into global markets. This shift isn't just a redirection of trade routes. It's a deliberate strategy to reduce vulnerability to U.S. manipulation through unilateral tariff policies. Canada chose a path that's safer and more diversified. A calculated strike at the very economic foundation the U.S. administration spent years building. If the $1 Canadian $88 billion investment stays on track, Canada's export routes to Asian markets could expand many times over, and the U.S.'s share in Canadian copper imports could fall sharply. What's the ripple effect? The U.S. will lose its preferred position in the copper supply chain, and more than that, its refining plants won't have enough raw material, leading to higher production costs and inflated product prices. In the end, American consumers will foot the bill, from power bills to electric vehicles to new infrastructure, all affected by this strategic reroute. Canada is no longer just a supplier. It's become a strategic competitor in the global game. It is now redefining how copper is mined, refined, and distributed worldwide. The U.S., which had hoped for self-reliance, but still lacks sufficient refining facilities, now finds itself pushed out of the core of a metal supply chain that Canada is increasingly steering. To conclude this section, Canada didn't react emotionally or defensively. It acted with a plan from the $3 billion in export figures to routing flows toward Asia, to the $88 billion Canadian investment. This is the beginning of a new chapter where Canada is no longer a dependent supplier, but a true strategic player in the race to control the global copper supply. Music. The 50% copper tariff didn't just provoke Canada's retaliation, it also threw American businesses into disarray, and consumers are now paying the price directly from their wallets. Each electric vehicle EV uses about 80 kilograms of copper for wiring, circuit boards, and motors. So when copper prices surge, the cost of producing each EV rose by roughly $90. According to analysts Reuters and EV industry experts warn that this price spike wasn't just a number on paper. It translated into massive burdens for companies like Tesla and Ford, which are reportedly losing millions of dollars per month. With several EV projects across the U.S. already postponed due to shortages in this critical raw material. In states like Ohio and Indiana, small manufacturers of electrical wiring and electronics are facing chaos. Imported copper wire has jumped 18% in price, causing them to lose a substantial portion of contracts to suppliers in Vietnam and Thailand, where copper prices remain more stable. Meanwhile, U.S. utility companies are seeing material costs soar, forcing them to file emergency requests for electricity rate hikes as copper-based conductors and transformer cores have increased by 22 to 25%. Even more alarming, a report from UBS projects that U.S. GDP could shrink by 0.5 percentage points this quarter alone as major industrial sectors stall, and businesses suffer $4, $2 billion in direct losses, exactly matching the amount of copper trade that Canada effectively froze from the U.S. supply chain. This isn't just a lost figure. It's a red flag for the entire economy. The disruption is widespread. The construction sector is grappling with surging prices for insulation materials. The EV industry is slowing due to supply chain delays. And the energy sector is scrambling to raise prices just to stay afloat. The direct impact on consumers is clear. From higher utility bills to more expensive home repair and construction services, all driven by skyrocketing copper costs. CBS News cited Ryan Young from Competitive Enterprise Institute. Copper tariffs will increase the cost of power transmission and grid maintenance, and consumers will be the ones ultimately footing the bill. It's not just about material costs either. Reuters and the Financial Times have reported that GM and other major automakers are posting shrinking profits, with GM admitting a $1 billion loss from earlier tariffs, and now bracing for an additional hit from the copper tax. Companies producing telecom equipment, renewable energy infrastructure, and electronics are facing the same pressure, forced to slash profit margins, delay investments, and possibly lay off workers if the situation drags on. Although the U.S. imported around 53% of its copper consumption from abroad in 2024, mostly from Chile and Canada, its domestic refining industry can only meet about 5% of demand, leaving a severe gap. As a result, the 50% tariff has only made the U.S. market tighter, more expensive, and dangerously unstable. Insufficient supply, skyrocketing costs, and looming industrial slowdowns. A warning sign is emerging. Many American businesses are still relying on legacy copper inventory to suppress price hikes. But when that buffer runs out, costs will become visible and unavoidable. The Financial Times and the week both stress that once stockpiles are depleted, businesses will face real costs that are hard to pass on, meaning consumers will see those charges show up in their bills in the months ahead. What seemed like a simple story about copper trading is now rippling across energy, telecom, EV, and construction sectors. Music. U.S. businesses aren't just bleeding billions. Everyday Americans are about to struggle with a rising cost of living. And this copper tariff may be the first trigger in a chain reaction of raw material inflation, production stagnation, and ultimately a slowdown in national GDP growth. When Canada officially withdrew from its role as a middleman in the copper export chain, the U.S. didn't just lose a strategic supply source. It lost control over a global supply chain it had dominated for decades. Electric vehicle prices in America are now spiking by $3,000 to $6,000 per car, while the cost of building a single home could climb by $17,000 to $22,000, all because copper prices soared after the White House's tariff decision. From light bulbs and in-wall wiring to EV charging ports, the value of copper is quietly reaching into every corner of American life. But instead of embracing integration to reduce risk, the U.S. has turned back to a closed-off tariff model full of volatility, full of uncertainty. Is this really the great deal Trump once promised? Or is it a self-inflicted rupture from the global trade network? This $2 billion shock may just be the opening salvo in a new trade era, one where America is no longer at the center. What do you think about this new economic order? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Deep State so you never miss the latest updates on global political and economic shifts.